everyone. So for today's lecture, we're going to be looking at Reconstruction. This is the period following the Civil War in 1865 that lasted until 1877. And what happened during this period was the country tried to reconstruct itself, try to rebuild the Union, come back together, but certain mistakes made during this era will have lasting impacts throughout history. The South was completely destroyed by the war. The war had been fought in the South. And so we'll look at just one state, Alabama, in 1865 following the war. The state suffered losses totaling $500 million. That can be estimated about $8 billion today. They lost their entire labor force to slavery when the slaves were freed. Every bank in the state had collapsed, so there was no money coming in or going out. And the farm output would not match pre-war levels for 40 years, 1900. So they were set back effectively 40 years because of the war. So like I said, the economy, the labor force, everything about the state was set back. So on April 11th, 1865, Lincoln gave a speech saying this is a moment of opportunity. As we saw at the beginning of the war, Lincoln had begun the war to try to keep the Union intact. And now that the war was over, he saw this as an opportunity to reunite the country, to rebuild it. Lincoln gave his final speech 3 days before he was killed by John Wilkes Booth. In this speech, he's quoted saying, "We met this evening not in sorrow, but in gladness of heart." He called for a righteous and speedy peace. And he urged the people of the United States to let them up easy. Let the South back easy. Do not punish the South. And he secured voting rights for the freedmen, the newly freed slaves. Lincoln wanted to be gentle and forgiving to the South. He wanted to really forgive the South for seceding and for the war. There were a lot of people in the North who wanted to punish the South, but Lincoln quoted saying he wanted malice towards none and charity towards all. He wanted to bind up the nation's wounds. He wanted to bring the country back together. As he had wanted to preserve the Union, he wanted to bring it back together again. Unfortunately, as I said, 3 days after his last speech, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, so he never got to see this out. And the Reconstruction that happens is way more damage than anything Lincoln would have wanted. Let's look at a couple personal stories after the Civil War. Let's look at how people lived directly following after the war. So Elisha Cunningham had lived in northern Alabama since 1817. He had owned a large farm, 20 buildings, and 13 slaves in 1860. His estate was worth $20,000 before the war. So he's doing well. He's got a large estate, several slaves, worth a lot of money. But by 1865, all of his Confederate money was worthless. He had no money. All his money was money of the Confederacy. His slaves had been freed. He could not even afford to buy seed, and he faced starvation. Couldn't even do that. So you can see how destroyed he is, how the example of Cunningham's farm shows the situation for a lot of people in the South. Here's the opposite side of the story. Here's Henry Cunningham, actually one of Elijah's slaves, who was freed and married Mary Bishop in January 1868, 2.5 years after the Civil War ended. They had both grown up as slaves, as property, no legal rights, powerless, but suddenly they had become people. Their marriage listed in the county record book. They had land that was his to own and use. So you can see the different sides. The world has changed. These people are now people. They're no longer property. The world has moved in a better way. However, life for African Americans would not be easy in the Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction on. So you get this as an example of Greene Cunningham. These are descendants of the slaves of that. Greene was arrested on March 30, 1908 in Shelby, Alabama for vagrancy. He was charged with a fake crime and tried by a county judge who would profit from finding him guilty. The reason he would profit from finding people guilty is he could sentence them to hard labor working for U.S. Steel. So effectively, Greene was re-enslaved, working in Slope Number 12, part of U.S. Steel. He was arrested for fake crimes, sent off to do forced labor. He died 5 months later from exhaustion. So you can see this is almost 50 years after the Civil War, and these wounds have not healed. What happened following Reconstruction was rampant discrimination. The Civil War had been fought, the slaves had been freed. However, life in the South was not an unracial society. Jim Crow laws were put in place to create separate societies. The Supreme Court upheld these laws in the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson when they set the precedent of separate but equal facilities, and lynchings were rampant. Lander Shaw was a man who was accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. A crowd of whites hung him up from a light pole, and 2,000 bullets completely riddled his body. You can see a picture here of white people at a lynching of a black man. You can see the lack of humanity. So this isn't a changed society in a lot of ways. Discrimination existed in schools, of course. You can see here education spending in Mississippi in 1900 was $60 per white child, $3 per black child. Look at the discrepancy there, the difference in how a white child is looked at compared to a black child by the government. So these are things that happen as a result of Reconstruction, as the failure of Reconstruction. In a lot of ways, the South became stagnant. It did not grow out of a Reconstruction, out of the Civil War. The South's economy returned to cotton, but instead of slavery, they relied on a system of sharecropping, where freedmen and poor whites could own a small plot of land that they farmed, basically cotton farmed, but they were tied to the land. They couldn't really ever make enough money to get away. There was virtually no development or improvement in a lot of the areas of the South. There were no roads, rail lines, crop rotation, or population growth. The Reconstruction in the South, in a lot of ways, is a failure.
Political views of racism became solidified in the South. The Democratic Party came to control this area of the southern United States. It controlled every single southern state from 1877 to 1964. In many places in the South, poll taxes and literacy tests were put in place to stop African Americans from voting. As late as 1940, only 3% of African Americans in the southern United States were registered to vote.
The question we really have to answer is, why did the Reconstruction fail? Why do we see this war of emancipation that Lincoln had fought? We hear these words that Lincoln said, and yet we see 100 years later or so, only 3% of blacks could vote in the South.
One of the huge problems of trying to reconstruct the country after the Civil War is that there were some deep, deep issues of hatred, of dislike, of these big divides between people. How do you make people who hate each other get along after decades of slavery and years of war? Think about the races. Think about the difference between African Americans who had been enslaved and white slave owners, whites in the South, whites in the North. How do you get two groups together after hundreds of years of slavery? The resentment between people who had been enslaved, the expectation of people who had had slaves, all of these different things. And think about the difference in the societies between the North and the South. The industrialized North versus the agricultural South. Places that have been virtually apart. This is one of the greatest ways of getting people to not get together, is to have them into separate spheres.
Construction was going to be extremely hard. 1 million people were dead, 20% of Southern white men. 600,000 people had died in combat, but of course there were other people who died of starvation, hardships in the war. 4 million slaves had been freed. The debt of $2.7 billion was twice what the U.S. had spent since it had been created in 1789. So how are they going to pay for all this? They had spent so much on the war, they were so far in debt. You can see a picture here of kind of the desolation and the despair in the post-Civil War South. And although the war is over, the nation is still broken. There are conflicting ideas of goals between different sides following the war. So the freedmen, of course, wanted to overhaul the South. They wanted to redistribute land, take land from those plantation owners and give them to the freedmen. And they wanted to help. They wanted help to achieve equality. They wanted to become equal to the white men. Radical Republicans in the North wanted to punish the South. Like I said, this is one of the few wars in which the victors do not come in and purge the losers, do not take out the leaders, do not have massive reprisals because of the war. But the Radical Republicans wanted to do that. Many Southern whites just hoped to be left alone. They wanted the South left alone. They had been through war and just give us a chance to rebuild. And finally, Northern whites kind of wanted to do as little as possible and move forward. They had been forced to go fight in the South. Many people had forced to sacrifice. Now that the war is over, let them rebuild, leave them alone. We do not want anything to do with them. As he had during the war, Lincoln takes the lead for Reconstruction. Lincoln tried to enforce his ideas as the war was coming to an end in 1865. Lincoln wanted to rebuild and reunite the nation as fast as possible. Lincoln was one of the greatest presidents this country had ever seen. He was going to rebuild and reunite this great union. His idea was to create a 10% plan. Basically, what this plan states is that these southern states had actually never left the Union. They had just been in rebellion. These states would be restored to the Union when 10% of the 1860 voters pledged allegiance to the Union. So only 1 in 10 people had to pledge allegiance to the Union to readmit these southern states. But the game changer was when Lincoln was assassinated. John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln on April 14th, 1865 in the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Booth actually shouted out "Sic Semper Tyrannis," which is the saying that's on the Virginia flag, but that means "thus always to tyrants," basically stating that Lincoln was a tyrant, overthrowing him. But what happens is, without Lincoln's leadership, Reconstruction is in for a problem. President Andrew Johnson briefly took over Reconstruction. However, Johnson allowed radical Republicans in Congress to influence Reconstruction. So this means those radical Republicans who wanted to punish the South gained power over Lincoln, who really wanted to rebuild the Union. President Johnson's Reconstruction would last from 1865 to 1867, and it would be a mess in many sense. So Lincoln is succeeded by Andrew Johnson as his vice president, becomes president following the assassination of Lincoln. Johnson was, before the war, had been a senator from Tennessee. He was a Southern Democrat who had flipped parties and had been Lincoln's running mate in the 1864 election. But because of this, Johnson is sympathetic to the South. He is a Southerner. So he actually supports Lincoln's Reconstruction plans of quickly readmitting the Southern states, but he was also very friendly to the Southern states. He pardoned high-ranking Confederates, basically not punishing them for what they had done. And he also was racist. He didn't care about the plight of the freedmen or the freed slaves, and he was kind of willing to sacrifice them in order to quickly rebuild the South. He wanted to rebuild the South, didn't care about what happened to them. So what happens is a lot of the same old story. The Southern states returned a lot of the Confederate leaders back to office. They voted these people back in. You can see this with the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, was one of Georgia's 2 senators. He was voted as a senator. However, many radical Republicans in Congress refused to seat the newly elected officials. They would say, these are the people who rebelled. We will not allow them to be part of our Congress. A lot of these southern states also created laws known as black codes. And what these laws were intended to do was recreate the old social order, recreate the order of a white supremacy, where white people ruled and black people were subservient. So this created a society. These black codes created laws in which freedmen could not own property, employ people, leave their job without permission. So they're not slaves, but yet they can't leave their job. Carry a weapon, testify against a white person, or marry a white person. You could see the bigotry and racism here of trying to recreate a society of a hierarchy where whites still have control over those freed African Americans. Andrew Johnson quickly comes into conflict with the radical Republicans in Congress. So in this period, he actually vetoes 21 of the bills passed by a Republican Congress. Remember, he is a Republican, but he's a Southern Republican. So he vetoes 21 of their bills. The radical Republicans overrode 15 of those vetoes. They overrode his veto of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was a government organization intended to help freed slaves, the freedmen, get back on their feet, create a life. The radical Republicans also overrode his veto of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Basically, this was an act passed saying that the black codes were unconstitutional. Johnson vetoes that. The radicals overturn that, basically saying these black codes shouldn't stand. They do not work. And due to these conflicts with Johnson and the Congress, the Republicans in Congress impeach Andrew Johnson in the House of Representatives. They drew up what was known as the Tenure of Office Act. They basically created a law so they could impeach him. So Johnson is impeached in the House. And you can see here a ticket to the amendments of the trial in the Senate. So once he's impeached in the House, the trial goes to the Senate. He survives getting thrown out of office by 1 vote in the Senate. But what this really shows is that Johnson is in conflict and that Johnson doesn't have the power to be able to face these radical Republicans. So what follows this is what's known as the Radical Republican Reconstruction, which will begin in 1867 and last into the 1870s. Radical Republicans angrily opposed Lincoln and Johnson's plans to let the South back in easily, to let the South rebuild their societies exactly the same way they had been before the war. They wanted to punish the South and force it to change. The ideas for the Radical Republicans, they wanted to protect freedmen's civil liberties. They wanted to protect their liberties as they would be as citizens of the United States. They wanted to ensure that African Americans could vote. This is a big thing. Like I said, they had tried to reinstate these hierarchies in society in the South. They wanted to make sure that African Americans would vote to get around this. And they also wanted to disenfranchise ex-Confederates. They wanted to not allow ex-Confederates, people who had rebelled against the Union, to be able to vote. So what happens is a military occupation of the South. The military goes in basically to make sure that they can keep order, that these southern states will not enforce these black codes, things like that. So Republicans took control of every southern state. During this period, 2,000 African Americans actually held public office. So think about that. They had gone from being slaves to holding public office. Um, they raised taxes in the South, established new schools, began to build roads, bridges, etc. So they are rebuilding the South, but they are rebuilding it as a different society. The Republican Congress passed 3 amendments dealing with the end of the war. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, abolished the institution of slavery. The 14th Amendment guarantees civil rights to citizens of the United States. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote, and you could not take away the right to vote based on race, color, or former life as a slave. So this guarantees the right to vote for African American men. However, in the 1870s, the Democrats regained control of Congress. Remember, the Democrats are the party of the South, so they push back against what is happening. But these people in the South, especially these white supremacists that grow out of the South, out of the Civil War, kind of create a situation where fear wins the day. The KKK and the White League grow out of the Civil War, and they actually intimidated Republicans from voting. They tried to keep Republicans out so they couldn't control office. One of the worst incidences is the Colfax Massacre. This is when redeemers, people who were trying to redeem the South, these white supremacists, killed 150 African Americans who tried to stop Democrats from stealing an election in Louisiana. Basically, they are killing people and trying to recreate the South through fear and intimidation. You can see that in the depiction here of the White League and the KKK holding down African Americans in the South. But what happens too is the economy collapses, and Northerners lose interest. Under the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, there was the Panic of 1873, which was an economic collapse, and this led to 25% of businesses going bankrupt in the country. So what you see is when people are concerned about the economy, they tend to lose interest in what's happening in the other part of the country. So the Panic of 1873 really causes the North to become concerned with their own things and forget more about Reconstruction. All of this culminates in the election of 1876, the presidential election. During this election, both sides actually cheated in what was an extremely close election. You can see here the electoral votes for Rutherford B. Hayes and for Governor Tilden of New York, basically the Democrats versus the Republican, 185 to 184 in electoral votes. So there's a lot of dispute as to actually who won. And in reality, no one actually knew who won. It was contested by both parties. What happens is they come up with the Compromise of 1877. So Southern Democrats agree to give electoral votes to the Republicans to elect Rutherford B. Hayes as President of the United States. In exchange, the Republicans agreed to end military occupation of the South and end Reconstruction. Basically, it's over. The Democrats, former Confederates, took over when the troops left. So the Democrats, the former Confederates who had fought the war, quickly take over once the military is removed and once Reconstruction is ended. You can see this here, this illustration of the Compromise of 1877. You can see the two parties agreeing, and you can see them stepping on an African American man. So what happens is these Democrats make life way tougher for African Americans. These people are the people who fought a war to preserve slavery, and now they have taken power again years after the wars. They enlist what are known as Jim Crow laws. These are racist laws designed to create separate societies for blacks and whites. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision actually upholds these Jim Crow laws. As long as they're separate but equal facilities, segregation is legal. Um, Democrats create poll taxes and literacy tests. These are designed to keep African Americans from voting. And as I said, in many southern states, even by the 1940s, only 3% of blacks could vote. They also institute a system of fear and system of um, killings known as lynchings. Basically, they would have trials or even not have trials. They would accuse African Americans of crimes and publicly execute them. You saw a picture of that earlier. So really horrible turnaround here as Reconstruction ends. So what we're really left is, what is the nation like in 1877? So the South is left bitter and physically damaged from the war. The scars of the war will be long lasting. You see them even today. Um, the Civil War is one of the few wars in history in which the losers continually bring up the war. That doesn't happen in other wars. Much of the South will still lay in ruin by 1877. Farms, factories, railroads, towns, and cities still lay in ruin to be rebuilt. The South begins to rely on sharecropping. Rather than slavery, people become tied to the land. And the South remains the poorest part of the country for the next 70 years. The North and the Midwest experience an economic boom because of the Industrial Revolution. The seeds of the Industrial Revolution, which we saw in the beginning of the 19th century, really take off in the second half of the 19th century into the 20th century. You see the rise of cities, you see the rise of great wealth. Some of the richest people who have ever lived in the world lived in this period, and they lived in the North and the Midwest. Of course, we see continued westward expansion. We see areas between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean being settled and developed after the Civil War. People continue to move west. Technological advances are making it easier for the country to spread. The Transcontinental Railroad has been in place. You can see here the connection between New York and San Francisco. The mechanical reaper, of course, makes it easier to farm. And then the invention of the telegraph and the telephone make it easier for the country to communicate. The government also promotes the idea of moving west. They also promote people moving west through the Homestead Act. Basically, this is an act that gives free land for settlers. So this is, if you are willing to go out west, this is a sign for lands for the landless, homes for the homeless. In Nebraska, the government will give you 40 acres as long as you are willing to farm and till that land. As long as you're able to produce on that, that land is yours. So you have to imagine this is the expansion of the American dream out west. The West, once again, is that American dream, is the idea that you can have land, get away. Especially you have to think about the destruction of the South. People wanted to leave. So you get cowboys, farmers, and Southerners who move westward to stake their claim. But of course, this is where the Indians have been pushed back from the East Coast. And the Indians will continue to be exploited into this period. So we'll be looking at this as we move into industrialization, further westward expansion as the country moves out of the 19th century into the 20th century.